Good afternoon. Welcome back to my office. I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about some issues related to morality and education, and particularly as they relate to Plato and to our own modern moral crisis. There are a lot of people in our world who think that America is in the state of moral crisis, that we have a lot of areas where our sense of right and wrong is out of line. We have rampant drug abuse and spouse abuse and child abuse, and we have just all kinds of prejudicial behaviors toward each other. We have all kinds of cheating and stealing and lying, and that's not just among the criminals and the thugs of the world. It seems there's a moral crisis even among our leaders, and so one wonders if people in Washington or in our state in Frankfurt have been taught what they should have been taught about right and wrong and how to behave. And so because of that sense of crisis, there is a lot of conversation in education today about how to raise the next generation differently, to do a better job so the kids grow up to be good people. Not just people who can make a good living, but people who can be good human beings, good citizens, good neighbors, and all those kinds of things. Reading the literature out there in most states, there's a lot of push towards what's called character education, and there are different philosophical views represented in different approaches to moral ed. But what I'd like for us to do now is think about some insights that Plato might bring to that conversation. Excuse me. Plato believed that Athens had experienced a terrible moral crisis that contributed to the fall of its golden age. And he attributed that to teachers who didn't teach the right values. And in his case, he's really concerned about the idea of relativism and undermining the values of the culture. But he was also concerned about the question of how we instill the good values in young people. It's not enough if we understand that something is right or wrong. How do we actually help young people to live according to those moral principles? And he expressed that actually with an equation. Knowledge equals virtue. Now, I don't know how that sounds to you, knowledge equals virtue, but what he seemed to mean was that there's a one-to-one relationship between knowing what's right and doing it. If you know what's right, you'll do it. If you know something is wrong, you won't do it. Now that makes sense, right? You wouldn't do something that you knew was morally wrong, would you? Okay, maybe, have you ever done something you consider morally wrong? Did you know it was wrong when you did it? Now, Plato says knowledge equals virtue, and that seems to me, frankly, silly, because I sometimes do things that I know to be wrong. Knowledge did not equal virtue. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. Now, how could such a brilliant thinker have made such a stupid mistake as to assume that knowledge equals virtue? Surely he knew of people who did things that they knew were wrong. Well, and I think the answer to that goes back to the question of what does he mean by knowledge? It goes back to his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. And I think he had a different definition of knowledge than what we probably are assuming when we say, I knew it, but it was wrong, but I did it anyway. Remember, Plato believes that knowledge is not information that is given to you by another person. It is that which you have discovered through your own intellectual processes. Deep within you are buried the fundamental truths of the universe. They can be drawn out through a rigorous intellectual process, which is facilitated if you get with somebody who disagrees with you. You have a debate, a Socratic dialogue. You point out the errors of my logic, I point out the errors of your logic, and in the process we get closer to the truth, closer to each other. So what he means by knowledge is the conclusions of that kind of process. So when we say knowledge equals virtue, we may mean something very different. We say, well, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't do it, meaning somebody told me I shouldn't do it. But he says somebody telling you something is not the same as you knowing it. You knowing it means that you have thought it through for yourself, you understand it, and he says that kind of knowledge affects behavior. Now, ironically, even though we can easily refute the idea that superficially given knowledge equals virtue, The fact is, our culture and our schools are filled with examples of just that kind of thing. For example, we have a problem with kids driving irresponsibly and endangering their own lives and the lives of others. And so we want them to drive more ethically, more virtuously. And so we give them a driver's ed class and we tell them about good driving. We don't engage them in a Socratic dialogue about the responsibilities of a driver. We simply give them information. We tell them. And we do that and assume that that's somehow going to change their behavior. That we assume that knowledge equals virtue, and we assume that it's the most superficial kind of knowledge that equals virtue. And I think Plato would say, we're the ones who don't make any sense here. We have a problem with kids behaving irresponsibly with regard to their sexuality. And so we say, this is not good, we want to change their behavior, so we have a sex ed class. And in that sex ed class, we may do nothing more than give them information. Tell them, don't do this, don't do that. We give them numbers, we give them statistics. But we probably don't engage them in a real Socratic dialogue about whether or not promiscuity is acceptable, is okay. And so that raises an interesting question too, because generally we feel like our programs don't work very well. We have drug ed programs. We love our drug ed programs in some cases, but the research indicates they don't really help very much. We go in and we tell them, don't do drugs, don't do drugs, don't do drugs. It doesn't make much difference. We feel good for having said it. So why is it our programs don't work very well? It may be because we're teaching them in the wrong way. We are teaching them by telling them instead of engaging them in a serious conversation, a serious dialogue, a discourse about these things where they think for themselves and come to the truth of the matter through their own rational processes. Plato, I think, would certainly say, you can't expect your moral ed programs to work unless you engage students deeply in thinking about why something is wrong. So why don't we do it? If we feel like our programs don't work very well, why don't we try his approach? Why don't we have a Socratic dialogue in our sex ed class about promiscuity, or a Socratic dialogue in our driver's ed class about speeding? Well, pick any other area where we have moral concerns. Those are some of the ones that jump to mind when we talk about teenagers. Now, here's what I'm picturing. I'm picturing this scene. See if this resonates with you. Imagine Johnny comes home on Friday afternoon and Mom says, "What did you guys talk about in sex ed today?" And he says, "Well, we talked about promiscuity." "Well, you talked about promiscuity. What did your teacher say about it?" "Well, the teacher never really took a position. We just had a debate about it." "You had a debate about promiscuity in sex ed?" "Yeah." "Your teacher never took a stand?" No. You know, there were people in your class who argued that was good? "Well, yeah, half the class took that position." That might not be a politically acceptable thing for Mom to hear. She may be very upset. She may say, "I don't want you teaching my kid to think about sex. I want you to teach him what I think about sex or drugs or anything else." And there comes a big rub there. Do we want them to think for themselves, or do we want to teach them what we think or what their parents think? Plato, Socrates, they're committed to teaching the kids to think for themselves. They have a confidence that kids can get to the truth. This is not all about relativism. It's about getting to the truth. Do we have that confidence in our kids' ability to think, to get to the truth? Would you, as a teacher, want to lead that discussion? Would you feel comfortable about it? And here I think is a big issue. Many of us would not want to lead that dialogue about promiscuity or about drug abuse because we've never thought through these issues for ourselves. We don't know deeply in our own minds why these things are wrong. The culture has taught us it's wrong. We sort of makes sense at some general level, and so we pass it on. But if you had to really defend why you believe what you believe, could you do it? And if you were moderating a debate among students on these things, could you do it? Now, this raises a whole other host of questions about the kind of people teachers need to be as well. But this kind of conversation doesn't seem to be much involved in our conversations about moral ed these days, and I thought it might be useful for you to plug Plato's thoughts into your thoughts about that. Thanks.